The nature, moments, and movement of this knowing have then shown themselves to be such that this knowing is a pure being for self of self-consciousness. It is I that is this and no other I, and which is no less immediately a mediated or superseded universal I. It has a content which it differentiates from itself, for it is pure negativity or the dividing of itself. It is consciousness. This content is, in its difference, itself the I, for it is the movement of superseding itself, or the same pure negativity that the I is. In it, as differentiated, the I is reflected into itself. It is only when the I communes with itself in its otherness that the content is comprehended. That is in terms of the notion. Stated more specifically, this content is nothing else than the very movement just spoken of, for the content is spirit that traverses its own self and does so for itself as spirit by the fact that it has the shape of the notion in its objectivity. Paragraph 799 is the third in this sequence of 4 short paragraphs that are transitioning us across the threshold, not only numerically into the 800s as far as the numeration of the paragraphs go, and once we get there, we've only got 8 more paragraphs to cross before we finish up with the phenomenology. But there's also an important transition taking place as we move across that first finish line into the 800s, as you're going to see in the next paragraph. Here, we're kind of wrapping up with this discussion of the shape of consciousness, that absolute knowing, this section, this not just section, but what is being represented, or better put, conceptualized, right? Thought out conceptually by the phenomenologist, by Hegel, by us, the readers, in this, which is the shape that we ourselves are taking on as, what do you want to call us? Tag-alongs, emissaries, participants in spirit. So that's what's going on with this. And you notice at the end of this paragraph, we have the shape, right, the gestalt of what? The notion or the concept, the Begriff in its objectivity, its Gegenständlichkeit. So that's what absolute knowing is really going to be about, or at least part of it. And what we see here is a really concentrated discussion of what it is at this point to be an I, or an ego, if you prefer, an Ich, right, in Hegel's German. So he starts this in a very dramatic way. The nature, moments, and movement of this knowing, right? So this is a rather summary, right? The nature, what the thing is of this knowing, the moments, all the different parts of it that are incorporated, and the directionality, the movement, the orientation of this knowing, this Wissen, have then shown themselves to be such that what? This knowing is a, and here we get something that has been said before, pure, rein, being for self, für sich sein, right? Für sich sein, nothing really radically new there, of self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein. Now, the idea that self-consciousness is being for itself, again, we encountered that all the way back in the self-consciousness section, but we shouldn't forget that as the Hegelian dialectic goes along, we're not just replicating, reproducing what it is that we saw before. That's why, people, this is a bit of a side note here, or an aside, people who will say, oh yeah, Hegel, I know that guy, master-slave dialectic, you can see it everywhere. Hegel would be looking at those people and saying, you don't get it, do you? We get beyond the master-slave dialectic. As a matter of fact, we don't just get beyond it. I mean, it does replicate itself in the present in certain dynamics, but as a overarching culture, civilization, whatever you want to call us, that human beings have become over the centuries. We left that rudimentary stuff behind long ago, right? And we get to more and more complicated matters, right? Complicated shapes. So, what is this pure being for self of self-consciousness? It is I. Now, here's where he's going to set out two different interesting sides. So it is I, right? And when we say that, we're saying that, well, Hegel is saying he is an I, right? He is the one who sees this development, this dialectic that has taken place, and now can call it absolute knowing. But we too, you as an I, me as an I, and there's two really important sides of this. So there's a side of particularity or even individuality. He doesn't use those terms there. Instead, he says this and no other I, right? So this I, the I that I am, and no other I, not that I over there, not the I that you happen to be. But at the same time, this I is also, now here he's maybe even like playing with words, no less immediately, right, unmittelbar, a mediated, vermittelt, and superseded, aufgehobenes, universal I. So this is the case for all of us at a certain point in development, right? So long as we have a stake in this vast process of, well, what's spirit? What is the point of all this? What is the essential? What is the wesentlich, right? What do I actually know? We are part of this mediated and superseded universal I. We're not just this I, the particular I that we are, and both of these are equally I when we say that it's encapsulated in both, at least at this stage of the dialectic. So now he's going to talk about content, Inhalt. And there's an interesting play with words here, right? So it differentiates, it's dividing, it's differentiated. All of these are using unterschieden or unterschieden, right? Or unterschieden. There's a verb and a noun that are playing a role there. We could also say dividing, splitting into parts. He's actually going to use some other vocabulary along with that. So he says it has a content. Now, he doesn't say it is a content. It has a content, right? Which it differentiates from itself. So then he goes on and he says, for it is pure negativity. Well, what's the it? The I. The I is pure negativity. We've seen this already. That's part of self-consciousness. That's part of consciousness as such, even consciousness of the object that we're taking in sense certainty. Consciousness is more. It is a negativity that doesn't fit into what the content itself is. And so it's engaging in this differentiating it from itself, the dividing of itself, right? So another, term there that's similar. It is consciousness. The content is in its difference. All of these are the same thing, just expressed as nouns and verbs. Dividing, splitting apart, but maintaining connection between them. Not dividing as like, you go over there, and I'm forgetting about you. You go over there, I'll pay attention to you. They're both part of the process. So what happens with this dividing? This superseding itself, the aufheben, right? This is the aufheben of the I itself by the I within itself. So he goes on and he says, the pure negativity that the I is, in it as differentiated, the I is reflected into itself. In sich reflektiert, right? Is just a cognate right there. So what does that mean? It is only when the I communes with itself. Now, communes is kind of a big term. Hegel doesn't actually use that. It's just with itself. When the I is with itself. So communing is fine, but it doesn't imply this very new agey kind of sounding thing. It communes with itself in its otherness, in its being other, that the content is comprehended. So, begriffen, it is grasped conceptually, no longer just as we had in religion through representation or through some sort of participation in a community. It is actually grasping, it is comprehending itself in its totality here as an I, as the end of history, if we want to look ahead a little bit, right? And so he's going to say, now he has in terms of the notion in brackets, and that's right? This is in terms of the concept, the Begriff. So now he says, stated more specifically. So if we want to rephrase this, what's going on? The content is nothing else than the very movement just spoken of. Now, which movement? I think we can see two references here. One is the movement of differentiating and thereby superseding or sublating. That's part of it. But, how did we actually begin this paragraph? The nature, moments, and movement of this knowing. I think that's another reference there. So, the very movement just spoken of for the content, the inhalt, the content that the I has, is nothing else. The content is spirit that traverses its own self and does so for itself. Once again, we go to the being for itself, right? As spirit by the fact that it has. Now, here's where we began. It has the shape, the gestalt of absolute knowing, right? The shape of the notion, the shape of the concept, the Begriff in its objectivity, its Gegenständlichkeit, is something that can be put out against ourselves. That's why it has to differentiate, right? Because without the differentiation, you can't actually look at it and wrap your head around it. Another way we could talk about Begriffen as the I that you are, grasping what and what of and where you're going, right? That's the nature and moments and movement that we started with. All of that is sort of encapsulated in this, and Hegel is unpacking it for us here in this short little paragraph. But as regards the existence of this notion, science does not appear in time and in the actual world before spirit has attained to this consciousness about itself. As spirit that knows what it is, it does not exist before and nowhere at all till after the completion of its work of compelling its imperfect shape to procure for its consciousness the shape of its essence, and in this way to equate its self-consciousness with its consciousness. Spirit that is in and for itself and differentiated into its moments is a knowing that is for itself a comprehension in general that as such substance has not yet reached. That is, substance is not in its own self an absolute knowing. Paragraph 800 brings to a close this sequence of 4 short but very important transitional sections or passages within this last section of the Phenomenology. And you notice Hegel here, he's already used the term Wissenschaft or science just a few paragraphs before, but now it's going to take on a greater role, and we're saying something really interesting about it in relation to time, Zeit, which we're going to be looking at in the paragraphs yet to come. And we'll hold off on that for just a second. There's a lot to say about that. But also in actuality, Wirklichkeit. And before we talk about the time thing, let's talk about actuality. I've mentioned this many times within this commentary on the phenomenology, and I think that people sometimes lose sight of this, that Hegel is continually trying to steer us back to actuality. If we don't exist, or our ideas or concepts don't exist and do something in the real world, then the idealism that Hegel is engaged in becomes sterile. And this is, sometimes critiques that he'll make of other thinkers, right? Your idealism just winds up being this, night in which all cows are black, for example. We want real life. We want an idealism that isn't just us being stuck in our heads or writing cool things down on paper and sitting around the coffee shop and chatting about them. We want real stuff. And so Wissenschaft, science in the very broad sense, better somehow translate into that and not just become something, as we often joke about, in the ivory tower, right? Now, in time, it's not just time that we're talking about here. When you see him talking about time, think of something that makes it distinctively human time, history. The time that is meaningful, not just time passing willy-nilly as in, numbers that we could count up or something, but time that matters, time in which things have developed. Another key idea that we're going to be talking about here, imperfect, perfection, really more development, unfolding, things becoming what they ought to be. So he goes on and he says, as regards the existence, the Dasein, again, Wirklichkeit, right? Being there, being actual, of this notion, of this Begriff. What Begriff? What notion? The shape of the notion in its objectivity that we just referred to in the previous paragraph, right? The Gestalt. The existence of this notion, science does not appear in time and in the actual world before something important happens. And it's been happening throughout the entire phenomenology. Before spirit has attained to this consciousness about itself. Now, spirit has been engaging in this. It had some consciousness about itself even before we reached the spirit section, in consciousness, in self-consciousness, and then, its transformations, in reason, in the spirit section, in religion. All of these are the ways in which this thing that Hegel calls spirit or Geist is unfolding itself through us human beings throughout our history, bit by bit by bit. This is the dialectic, and this is how it actually works. And it's a messy process, which is only partially encapsulated here in the phenomenology, or even if we want to extend it to other Hegel works, like think about his lectures on various topics where we see developmental stuff going on, or the, philosophy of right, thinking about political and social matters, or the Encyclopedia Logic, or the Science of Logic. All of these are developmental. So he goes on and he says, as spirit that knows what it is, what it is, again, referring back to the previous paragraph, the nature, moments, and movement of this knowing. That is spirit knowing what it is. This does not exist before, and nowhere, nirgends, nowhere at all, till after the completion of this work, the Vollendung der Arbeit, the laboring, the work that spirit has been doing this entire time. And what has it been doing? It is going from its imperfect, we can say shape, Gestaltung, which is not the same thing as Gestalt, right? So think of this as rudimentary, unvollkommene, right? So we have you notice these voll there, those two terms coming up. Vollendung, vollkommene, right? The development, the unfolding, the unpacking, the complexifying, if you like. So the imperfect shape is one that is not yet brought to its fruition. It's partly there, right? It's not nothing, but it's not what it needs to be. And we would be mistaken to stop and say, the essence of Hegel's doctrine is what happened in the master-slave dialectic, or force in the understanding, or, the freedom and the terror, pick whatever other thing you want. Those are all imperfect shapes, and they are being compelled, bezwingen is the term he used here, through this completion of the work that's compelling them into what? Into the shape of its essence. The Gestalt now, seines Wesens, its most essential thing, right? Compelling its imperfect shape. And so translated here, to procure for its consciousness the shape of its essence. Now, procure here might not really be the best term. Verschaffen is the term that Hegel uses. Schaffen is to shape, to mold, to create, to bring into being, right? And the Ver here, sort of an intensifier, I would say in this case. The shape of its essence is being developed by spirit through history, through this process, and it is shaping itself. It doesn't have an external shaper. And here, a little bit of a digression. Think back to the religion section, right? Why did we had all this cool stuff happening through reason and spirit, the two biggest sections of the work. The gods did enter in there, or the divine, but it's mostly, human affairs. And we get this, you could even say more and more secularizing, or at least turning the divine into something human, a humanistically understanding picture of social reality, the reality that we live in, the reality that spirit inhabits and shapes. Then we go into this religion section. Why do we do that? Well, by the end of the religion section, we actually have a pretty humanistic form of Christianity that, Feuerbach will pick up and run with, to be sure. But Hegel also wants to tell us that it's not a creator from up on high, totally transcendent to the world and also mysteriously immanent to it, that creates the world, that engages in Schaffen, right? It's spirit itself, which we're part of, which we can understand. We can not only understand, but comprehend. We can grasp it with concepts as us being part of that. So, digression over, back to this. Now, Hegel says something else that's very interesting here. Over and over and over again in the Phenomenology, he's been talking about consciousness and self-consciousness, right? And how do we bring the two of them together, right? And sometimes it's consciousness is in itself or of the in itself, and then self-consciousness is for itself. We're going to see all that come together here. But what's happening in this process of moving to the shape of the essence, the completion of the work, is that self-consciousness and consciousness are equated. Now, the term there, auszugleichen, right? Ausgleichen is the term. Gleichen, as I've mentioned many times before, it can mean equate, to make things equal, but it doesn't necessarily mean to make them identical, right? So equating them means making them adequate to each other, making them actually fit, making them commensurate. Self-consciousness and consciousness can come together and be harmonious, you could say, right? And that's ultimately what science is supposed to be like for Hegel. When we're doing actual Wissenschaft, now there's all sorts of Wissenschaften, various sciences, disciplinary kinds of knowledge, and we can sort of stand back from them and look at them and be like, I am the knower, that is the known. Yes, except that we are also part of the known, and we are knowing ourselves as part of that known. So if the science is about history and human development, philosophy, art, religion, these are things that can actually be sciences for, Hegel's point of view, right? You can have a Wissenschaft or Logik, which is the next big book, right? But you can also have a Wissenschaft of Geschichte, science of history, and of philosophy and aesthetics. But also, if Hegel was around later on, of psychology, of sociology, these things, what we often call the human sciences, those are about us, right? And Hegel would say these researchers who think that somehow they're like the subject and everything else is the object, they're doing something that's not adequate to the scientific nature of their work, right? They've lost sense of that. They're doing something that is, in a certain sense, pseudoscientific. Not pseudoscientific in the sense that like astrology is, but be that as it may, coming back to the text, Hegel says, equating self-consciousness with its consciousness. Then he says, spirit that is in and for itself, and differentiated into its moments, is a knowing that is for itself. So being in and for itself as spirit means being a knowing for itself. What does this mean? A comprehension, begreifen in general, that as such, now he brings up another term, substance. Substance has not reached. Substance within the Hegelian dialectic is nearly always something in its beginning state, something that we study, something that maybe we're interested in ethically, but it doesn't have subjectivity the way that it ought to, as spirit does, and as science, in, again, its full sense, possesses for someone like Hegel. So he says, a comprehension, a begreifen, that substance is not reached. Why not? Because substance doesn't grasp things like that. Spirit grasps things. Subject grasps things. The self grasps things. Science grasps things. A comprehension in general that substance is not reached. Substance is not in its own self an absolute knowing. So does that mean, let's leave substance behind? No. We need to transform substance, and anything that still bears the mark of it, that bears the solidity of it, we need to transform that through the rest of this section, through this whole process, through spirit knowing itself into science, now coming into time and into the actual world. Something new is emerging, in the process of emerging. It's not emerging right this point in time. It has been emerging, and now it can recognize itself as emerging in time and actuality.